Let's start with what's been another terrifying weekend for the Jewish community in Australia. It began on Friday night in the Melbourne suburb of Caulfield when hundreds of anti-Israel protesters stormed a park across the road from the local synagogue. Things turned ugly, surprise, surprise, with police evacuating the synagogue and using pepper spray to subdue protesters.
Oh, the pepper spray's out!
Then yesterday in Sydney, we had anti-Israel protesters on jet skis trying to block the passage of an Israeli-owned ship, claiming it was transporting weapons to Israel. And in Melbourne, a war memorial was defaced with anti-Israel graffiti. Chris, we'll get to some of the international protests we've seen shortly, but domestically, these protests and clashes are becoming more and more heated. Are we okay with this? And if we're not, what are we going to do about it?
James, this is the worst thing I've seen unfold in our country for my generation, I reckon. I just think it is so disgusting. It's so sad. It runs against everything that we think this country stands for, the tolerance in our diversity. This is ethno-religious violence playing out on our streets. It's what the whole country exists to avoid. And we've been worried about it, especially when it comes to Islamist extremism over the past couple of decades. Not enough people have taken it seriously. It's been inflamed now by these events in the Middle East. But we've got to call it out for what it is. And this Me Tooism and whataboutism and false equivalence we're getting from politicians, especially the federal government, is not good enough. There's an obvious aggressor here. Now, it's the supporters of the Palestinians, and we all fear for innocent Palestinians caught up in this war at the moment. But these protesters are deliberately going to Jewish areas, intimidating, insulting and threatening Jewish people in this country, their fellow citizens. It's abhorrent. They were chanting death to the Jews, gas the Jews. Now they're going into their neighbourhoods and stirring up trouble. I weep for the country. There's sort of half of me just wants to weep about this because how have we allowed this to happen? But you can't do that. You've got to think, what do we do to fix it? And the first thing we need to do is have politicians and law enforcement authorities on the front foot, stamping out the aggressors.
Yeah. Danica, this started obviously, 4 weeks ago on the steps of the Opera House, Gas the Jews. We were all horrified by that.
Absolutely.
But you kind of thought, well, that's about as bad as it can go. But now we've got, motorcades of Palestinian supporters through Jewish suburbs.
Yeah.
It just keeps going and ramping up.
And not to mention some of the vision that we've already seen from yesterday's motorcade, which went through Coogee, which, as we know, one of Sydney's very wealthy suburbs, also has a high Jewish population. Yep. There were flags, they were radical Islamist flags that were being waved out of cars. Where were the police? During COVID, we all know police took a very heavy-handed approach. They would kit it out in full riot gear, full riot gear. Yesterday, they watched this parade go through and they didn't even step in. And as for that attack in Melbourne, the one that we were just discussing, it was deliberate. In front of a synagogue, there were people there in worship. They had to be evacuated.
You mentioned the Coogee situation. Yeah. We've actually got some vision, and you said, what are the police doing? Yeah. Have a look at this. Now, they're waving an ISIS flag. It's the black Islamic flag, which is a call to jihad. Check out these guys waving this flag and listen to what the police officer is concerned about.
Mate, keep your arms inside the vehicle. Thanks.
If I'm not worried about the jihadi flag, just keep your hand in the vehicle, please. We wouldn't want you to have a traffic violation.
Well, there is an infringement called protrude limb from vehicle, so the police could have taken action there if they wanted to. But look, to be honest, from the very beginning, I was very sympathetic for, like Chris mentioned, the innocent Palestinians who are trapped in Gaza, because like I mentioned on the show before, we have to remember everyone who is a member of Hamas is a terrorist, but not everyone in Palestine is a member of Hamas. And so innocent blood is as such, whether you're born on the border of Israel or whether you're born on the border of Palestine. But what these sorts of protests do when they resort to thuggish behaviour and when they resort to bullying tactics, like deliberately going to synagogues and things, they lose sympathy. If they had any sympathy, it gets lost in this tactic, it gets lost in this sort of thing. And it's stupid, it's foolish, and if they really want people to care about the innocent Palestinians and whatever geopolitical conflict they've got going on over there, they're not going to get it if they continue to behave like thugs.
That's the least of the problems, isn't it, Joe? That's the least of the problems is their cause. But what about the innocent Jewish Australians who are threatened and intimidated by this?
Yeah, I think you have to ask a very serious question, which is, what good do these people think that they are doing? What do they think they are going to get in return for these actions? Do you think that they will get more support from the Australian community if they deface the War Memorial on Remembrance Day? Do they think that by all means march in the streets and say what you think, but do you think by deliberately targeting areas with very, very high Jewish populations, it's going to make them seem less aggressive? And this gets us down to, I suppose, the original sin, and of course it goes way beyond October the 7th, but it gets down to the actions of Hamas itself. Now, they could have gone over the border, they could have done that operation, they could have targeted Israeli IDF personnel, they could have, if they wanted to, and I certainly would never endorse it, but they could have killed them, they could have abducted them, they could have used them as hostages, used them as bargaining chips, they could have done all of that, and they would have been in the same position politically, except without all the bad PR, right? But they did it, but instead they went over there and they killed women, they killed babies, they roasted babies in ovens.
Doesn't that get to the thing, right? So you said, what are they trying to achieve? They're not going to win any. Chris, aren't they just... Isn't this just an outlet to hate on Jews? They're not trying to...
I think that is the problem. The problem is...
Hamas is an Islamist extremist terrorist organisation. Hamas is ISIS, they are Hezbollah, they are Al-Qaeda, they are Jamaat Islamiyah. It's all the same ideology. They don't want a two-state solution. They would never tolerate it.
Their charter doesn't allow for it.
The charter doesn't allow for it. They want to eliminate all Jews, get rid of Israel as a state, and that's the starting point. Then they want to eliminate all infidels and have a global caliphate. That's what Islamist extremists aspire to, and that's an absolute focal point of their ideology. And so you've got to divide that from the Palestinian cause.
I think what's being lost here is that people have to remember that Hamas is the enemy here. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah, right.
And you have 102 Australian Holocaust survivors writing an open letter this week saying that they are genuinely scared. They never thought that living in Australia would ever amount to what they experienced and witnessed in Europe all those years ago. And I think this is what is being lost in this constant narrative at the moment.
So the problem is, though, Hamas is not just this sealed off, hermetically sealed thing that just exists in a bubble sitting above the Gaza Strip. The problem is Hamas is a government. It is the official government of Gaza, whether you like it or not.
Yes.
The elected government. It was elected by hundreds of thousands of Gazans who probably didn't know what they were doing, but nonetheless, and they've been radicalised even further since. And in the West Bank, they're scared to have elections because they know if they did, Hamas would probably get elected there too.
But where's the protests in Australia against Hamas?
But where are the protesters?
There are none.
Where are the protesters, or even the news reports in the Gaza Strip of Palestinians saying, Hamas, get stuffed, give the hostages back, leave us, abdicate so that we can be left in peace?
I want to show you this because, Chris, you mentioned earlier our politicians have got to take a strong stand.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Have a listen to Jacinta Allen, the Victorian Premier. She starts off talking about, the outrage of Jews being targeted. Then she realises, I better balance this up. But she can't think of anything that's been done to the Muslims in Australia in this circumstance. Have a listen.
What we saw on the streets of Caulfield last night was unacceptable. It was unacceptable that the members of the Jewish community did not feel safe in their own neighbourhoods and in their own communities. But two, it's also unacceptable that we see ongoing incidences of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and that is what we must work hard on supporting and working with our local communiais.
So we don't want Jews attacked, but we also don't want...
it's pathetic. There's a long history of this. And I want to explain it quickly, but before I do, I want to say, obviously, we welcome the huge Muslim communities we've had in Australia. They have been here for more than a century, nearly 200 years. The Afghans first came to Australia. They're a growing part of our community, and we all have a lot of Muslim friends in this country, regular guests on our program. So the overwhelming majority of Muslim Australians are not into this Hamas apology that we're seeing at the moment. But having said that, we have whipped ourselves over Islamophobia since 9/11. After 9/11, we got all this stuff. Oh, watch out for Islamophobia. There'll be a backlash against Muslims in Australia. Never happened. Again, after the Bali bombings, it's watch out, there'll be Islamophobia in Australia. It never happened. And the killer, the one that really exposed how pathetic this was the Lint Cafe siege in Sydney. Right. And while those Australians were still being held hostage by a nutter who was an Islamist extremist, remember 2 of them never came out of there, they started up a hashtag movement to protect Muslims on public transport based on a lie, based on a false example of a Muslim woman apparently being intimidated. It never happened. It was made up. So they're going, I'll ride with you, trying to fight back against Islamophobia. The police actually had an operation set up against Islamophobia that never occurred while Australians were being held hostage.
I think some of the statements as well that have been released the last 24 hours have been absolutely appalling. It took the Prime Minister 24 hours to release a statement on what happened in Victoria on Friday night. Not once in that statement did it mention anti-Semitism. The only strong statement that we saw was from Peter Dutton, who called it for what it was, and he said enough is enough.
We'll see if we can get that tweet up. It was a very strong statement, Danica. He goes on to say the behaviour we saw last night in Caulfield was provocative, it was deliberate, an act of incitement designed to end in violence, and predictably it did. He goes on to say enough is enough.
And moreover, back to what Chris said as well, like this idea that, responding to imaginary scenarios, imaginary threats. Now, this is the entire foundation of Nazism, incidentally, the idea that there's a secret Jewish cabal running the world. The provocation, in inverted commas, of this protest was supposedly an arson attack on a Palestinian-owned burger joint, right? And of course, everyone just saw that and thought, of course, it's the Jews.
Yeah. And
the police have said there is actually they don't think there is any racial or religious or political motivation to the attack at all. But again, take that as a tiny microcosm and then apply it to the conspiratorial, paranoid thinking of people in the Gaza Strip who, again, blame everything that is wrong with their lives, not on Hamas, not on the extremists who came out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and are now applying ISIS tactics to Palestinians, but to the Jews. It's always the Jews.